Let me start, though, in honor of Mike Moore and in honor of Roberto Azevedo. I'm going to start with this illustrious panel by asking a WTO question. And a little in the trade politics realm, and then we're going to move further into the trade politics realm. But there is an obscure provision of the Uruguay Round Act that says every 5 years, the Congress can vote to, by joint resolution, move the U.S. out of the WTO. Now, there hasn't been such a vote since 2005, right? 2005? Dorothy would know this too. And it was a really small vote. It was a pretty embarrassing vote. And the resolution, by the way, was offered by one Congressman Bernie Sanders, which is one of the reasons I raise it today, although this would have been a better question if we'd gotten the results of the Iowa caucuses, but we're not going to be too political today. So you all wander around the Hill, you talk to administration officials. We had a good conversation this morning about the WTO. What do you hear about the WTO, and is this going to be a nothing burger in 2020 because 2020 is that fifth year? Or is there some there, and what happens if some member of Congress launches such a joint resolution? Because once that happens under the Uruguay Round Act, there has to be a vote. Anna, would you like to just take a run at that one?
Sure, yeah. So thank you so much for having me, first of all. You have heard much more conversation in this town about the WTO recently, particularly from critics of the Trump administration. Of course, it provides, either a convincing counter-argument or a convenient foil, depending on how you look at it, that instead of taking this bilateral approach, we should join up with our allies and revise the rules at the WTO. But, given the significance of some of the proposals and the crisis at the WTO over the appellate body, I think you still just don't hear that much political conversation about the issue. When it compared to other economic issues and the China trade deal, USMCA, it just doesn't rise to the level of political saliency. So that conversation is kind of always somewhat suppressed outside of Washington policy circles. And that goes along with one of the main criticisms of the WTO, that it is, increasingly irrelevant, right? And I think, that argument becomes a little more obvious when you look at some of the issues around subsidies, for example. So the Trump administration's China deal has been criticized for not dealing with issues like SOEs and subsidies. But on the other hand, the WTO has this Boeing Airbus case over subsidies that's been going on for 15 years. So is the WTO doing a better job at dealing with subsidies? It does feed into that criticism. So we had the Director General's speech this morning. So I think the WTO obviously is taking these criticisms very seriously. And when I was in Geneva last year, I felt like the consensus there was that if the WTO was going to succeed, a key to that is the plurilateral approach, so clubs of like-minded countries getting together, and that really presented a way forward. But I guess I should get back to your question about the congressional vote. So in terms of that vote, it was rejected by a wide margin in 2000, 2005, and then I believe not brought to a vote, correct me if I'm wrong, in 2010 and 2015. So, the popular narrative about free trade has changed a lot since then. I still think that the majority of lawmakers would vote against such a resolution and that it would be difficult to pass. It is something that you can see the Trump administration viewing as a source of leverage. They really like to use that kind of brinksmanship. But in terms of working with Congress to, get lawmakers on board, I'm not really sure how realistic that would be. So, I think you could see it attract more attention next year, but bottom line, it would still be difficult to approve, even if there was a Sanders or another Trump presidency on the way.
Okay. Now, as we move into the realm of wild cards and other potential flashpoints in this year of trade politics, actually, every year has been a year of trade politics for the last couple of years, which I might note for the record, this is as strong a group of journalists in the trade policy, trade politics realm as we've seen. I mean, one of the things that's happened, I think you all would agree, because I think you're all consumers, most of you are consumers of trade journalism and specialized newsletters. The quality of that product has gone up so dramatically over the last several years. It's sort of one of the ironies of the interesting times we live in when it comes to trade policy. So thank you for that. So let's move ahead on flashpoints, potential flashpoints, and that obviously gets us to China. We had a really interesting China panel earlier today. I think most of you were here. And so I'm going to ask a variation on the issues that some of the issues that were raised today. And let me begin, perhaps, Dave, with you. They talked about the coronavirus and the implications of that. I'm going to ask a slight variation on that, which is, what do we think the prospects are of a phase 2?
This year?
Well, timing and let's say timing and prospects. Let's say this year or ever. Or you can call it phase 2, phase 3, and otherwise. And what would you think the contents are? Anna just talked about subsidies. We talked about SOEs. Speak to the issue of phase 2.
Yeah,
if you want to talk about phase 1, you can do that too. But
sure.
But
well,
I
I think you have to talk about phase 1 only insofar as that's likely to, the implementation of that is likely to delay the actual start of anything substantive on phase 2. The U.S., the president was in a big hurry, as you'll recall, to actually go over to China and kick off phase 2 personally, which was an idea that the Chinese seemed to know nothing about at the time it was first broached. That said, the Chinese position seemed to be, well, we're going to do phase 2, but let's implement phase 1 first. So that would have delayed things even under the best of circumstances. We're not under the best of circumstances now. We've got a raging epidemic, likely a pandemic, and I think the Chinese are going to have legitimate grounds to say, let's forget Q1 in terms of ramping up the purchases called for under the agreement, and let's take our time even more so in terms of getting started on phase 2. Now, when that happens, personally, I think there's zero chance that gets done before the election. I don't think the Chinese have any great incentive to do anything other than start the process and start talking about it. And then from their perspective, they can be gambling on the end of the Trump administration and having a different conversation potentially with his successor. So I think it's a next year development, and subsidies is the big unaddressed issue, along with cyber hacking and some other elements of the Chinese approach that were sort of left to the side. I mean, a lot of the real fundamental core U.S. complaints from the 301 process really haven't yet been addressed. Some of them have been nodded at, but if you consider that what was on the 1 yard line back in May was a 150-page agreement, we ended up with 82 or 86, I've forgotten now. There's a big chunk of it that was just sort of vanished in the end game. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the problem.
So, Jenny, thoughts on phase 2, contents of phase 2,
Yeah.
timing of phase 2?
Well, you said that, the Chinese will start the process and it's going to be fine to just start it and talk and then run out the clock. I kind of think this might also be fine for the Trump administration because they wrapped up something that they obviously call a win now and for the average consumer, not obviously anyone here in this room that knows about trade policy, they think that there's a deal with China now, and that's the first deal that's ever happened, and Trump says it's the biggest deal ever. So I don't know that they necessarily have to do more than start phase 2 to play up phase 1 and how much or how little is in phase 1. Someone mentioned to me, because the 150-page document obviously was a lot more illustrative on some of the issues that haven't been addressed in phase 1, but how much even the 150-page document addressed subsidies or some of the cyber stuff, some of the real core complaints is unclear. And someone who's maybe a little bit more cynical than us on the stage would say, well, the Chinese drew the red line where they see the 21st century issues that they want to advance. So anything that they gave us now, they know they don't need that to, surpass the US in all of these technologies. And so I'm maybe a little bit more of the cynical view that I don't know that even in a phase 2 or 3, any of the stuff that wasn't in phase 1 will ever be put on paper because the Chinese know where their red lines are.
So from the Chinese side, you're suggesting there may be an impetus to not put some of those things on the table. From the U.S. side, I've heard speculated that there are individuals on the U.S. side who don't believe the Chinese will ever either put those things on the table, or even if they do, will never comply. And this goes to the whole enforcement mechanism. And I think a lot of people were genuinely intrigued by the phase 1 enforcement mechanism. Does that suggest that the tariffs that are largely all still in place, certainly on intermediate goods and goods associated with China 2025, does that suggest those are here to stay? Mm-hmm. Thoughts on that,
Yeah.
Jenny?
James? It does seem like the tariffs are here to stay, and I think that for all the talk of phase 2, there are still huge questions surrounding what's going to actually happen with phase 1, and if you look at, we all know the purchase targets are, in some ways unrealistic or very, very ambitious. And with the coronavirus hitting now, demand in China is, projected to drop off pretty significantly. It may rebound later in the year, but we had, Larry Kudlow this morning on Fox Business saying that the export boom would be delayed. So, it's the administration really kind of conceding that there could be a delay here. On some levels, this kind of removes a bit of the pressure to immediately force implementation of the deal, and that might actually suit the Trump administration. But I think over the long term, if we're not seeing those purchases come through, I think it's going to put the Bob Lighthizer and USTR and everyone else in a pretty tough spot. Because they're going to have to explain why these purchases aren't actually coming through, and they'll have to debate whether to trigger the enforcement mechanism, and that's going to make for some very kind of tricky conversations. And of course, if that doesn't go well, then phase 2 is completely sort of off the charts. So I think there's still some very big questions. The other issue, of course, is on the sort of more modest measures that were taken in other areas like intellectual property, which don't necessarily address the 21st century issues. We still don't know exactly how that's going to be enforced, whether the Chinese are really committed to taking action on that front. So I think it's still unclear to me how phase 1 is going to actually shake out. And I think from President Trump's point of view, he's trying to sell this as his big deal on trade in his election year, but who knows, 3 months, 4 months from now, is it actually going to be working out for him politically?
So related to this, and any one of you, what do you think, we can do this by thumbs up, thumbs down, how many of you think that phase 1 will be subject to some kind of enforcement measure before the election.
Enforcement
Yes.
measure meaning he imposes tariffs, which is the ultimate hammer?
Something between now and the election.
No.
I think there might be consultations, but oh.
I think
No.
I think it depends.
Maybe?
No.
It depends on who
No.
he's running against. Maybe he has to put the hammer on if it's a Sanders or a Warren.
I think he's got what he wants politically. If you go back to that famous speech that Navarro always talks about back in June of 2016 in Monessen, Pennsylvania, right, where he laid out the indictment of the global elites and the Clintons who had screwed over the working class and the factories
You don't
in
mean
America.
March 2018 trade wars or
Are
easy
good
to
and easy
win?
to
Good.
win. No, I mean June 2016 on the campaign trail. It's a very interesting speech, and it's an absolute roadmap to the president's thinking. And he laid out 7 promises. He's kept every one of them. And so he can go on the trail now, and he's already doing it in the rallies, and effectively say, look, I told you I was going to rip up that crappy NAFTA deal, the worst deal ever made. I did that, got you a better deal. And I told you I'd stand up to China in a way nobody else has ever done it. I did. I confronted them. I've got this great phase 1 deal, which is going to thrill our great patriot farmers, and it's going to just rain money across the heartland. So he's got what he wants there. And when he wants a punching bag, that's the European Union.
Ah,
He can
okay.
beat up on the European Union for the rest
Okay.
of the year.
Maybe one more controversial point to the tariffs. Some people would maybe say, you said there's skepticism that China will ever live up to anything they promised in phase 2. Well, I think there's skepticism that they will even do what they put on paper in phase 1. So if you
That was what I was
think
asking.
that way, then the tariffs and having this big chunk of tariffs still in place is your main selling point, because you know you didn't get as much as you wanted from China, but you also didn't give up as much, right? You still have the big tariffs in place.
Unless you're a
so-
consumer or downstream.
No, they don't care about
manufacturer,
that.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, or farmer, or, yeah, all right, got it. Okay, well, this is very interesting. Now, so I'm going to do one more China question, and then I am going to go to the U.S., Europe. Well, I'm going to transition to Europe, but I'm going to do it via China, first of all. Our China panel today, you heard the case made for working with allies, Japan and Europe, and others. Brazil was mentioned, absolutely. And others that have the same concerns that we do about China, many of us do about China, and working with them to, coalitions of the like-minded to bring China along. I will say from personal experience, and I agree with that, by the way, and I wanted TPP to happen. We launched TPP at the end of the Bush administration. It didn't happen. But I can say for a fact that this notion of bringing the Europeans along as partners is so much easier said than done. James, tell me, before we start doing the transatlantic trade war, transatlantic trade agreement thing, talk about the prospects for the US and the EU actually working together on what should be no-brainer, like-minded concerns about a non-market economy and state-owned enterprises competing in market environments.
So I think that trust has broken down to a huge extent, over the last 3 years between the U.S. and the EU. It might not have been great on trade previously, but I think the chances of some kind of united front coming together, which I think the Chinese are genuinely concerned about, have been diminished by the fact that the EU feels like it's being unfairly targeted. So it's very hard to.
There is that.
It's very hard to bring the Europeans on board if you're threatening them with car tariffs and, in particular, digital tax tariffs, and imposing steel and aluminum tariffs. And I think that has encouraged those in Europe who want a more sort of pragmatic approach to China to kind of try to play it both ways rather than align themselves squarely with the US. Now, it's true that there's also been kind of an awakening, I would say, in Europe about the sort of unfair trade practices by China, and I think the Commission in particular and other countries have been trying to kind of take a firmer, tougher approach, and they do share a lot of those concerns. But I think there's also kind of geographically within Europe a pretty clear split, and you see that I was in Rome for 4 years with the FT, and you can see that especially the more sort of economically vulnerable countries in Europe are clamoring for Chinese investment. They're joining Belt and Road. They don't really have any you know, they're trying, you know, they want Huawei to be part of their 5G networks, a bit like, you know, even the UK gave them a limited role. And so the EU is trying to kind of, in a way, play both sides, and they don't like to be pigeonholed. And I think that, you know, with the tariffs and tariff threats multiplying, it just makes it all the harder for Pompeo and Lighthizer too to kind of make the case that you need to side with the U.S. and have a common front. And I think that's where we are today, and it'll be very interesting to see how this discussion unfolds the next few months.
So the FT's had some interesting nuanced pieces on this. What I can't tell is whether you think, we think, you all think, are we more likely to have a trade war with Europe or trade agreements with Europe? And you can separate the EU, US, and the UK, US. Who wants to take that?
Well, I think we've seen a pretty clear model here from the Trump administration in its previous negotiations, and that is a lot of trade fights and tariffs and then a mini deal, right? So I think that looks like a pretty realistic prospect when you look at the European Union. And you know, there are a lot of tensions right now over the digital sales tax in particular, but also airplane subsidies. And you know, the specter of auto tariffs has appeared again to haunt us. So, you know, clearly there are some very serious tensions. If the European Union has the opportunity to put that to rest by doing some kind of mini deal with the Trump administration, I think there might be the willingness to do that.
Dave?
I think, I mean, first I should caveat this by saying just about every prediction I've made about Donald Trump has been wrong since he rode the escalator. So take any and all of this with a grain of salt. But I think apart from whatever substantive dispute is going on, I think there's a real philosophical divide between this administration and the Europeans. And I spoke several months back to somebody who was close to Lighthizer, who put it in terms that really surprised me. He said, you have to understand, we don't share the same values as the Europeans. Now, I used to cover the Pentagon. I've spent, you know, a long time listening to the exact opposite argument, that in fact, we are all part of the same transatlantic community. We do share the same values, et cetera. That's why we stood up to the Soviet Union for 40 years. But this was a very well-articulated thought that, you know, they're all about surrendering national sovereignty to a big amorphous undertaking. They have different views on privacy and all sorts of stuff.
Cautionary principle.
Yeah, and you know, we're not all on the same team. And I think if you listen to some of the nasty things the president says about the Europeans, he has said explicitly they're worse than the Chinese.
He's mainly focused on autos.
On autos, but that's not typical language from an American president,
That's
to
true.
put it mildly. but I say, I bring that up only to underscore, I mean, I was surprised to have it expressed to me in those terms. And I think it is worth bearing in mind.
Jenny?
I think it depends on maybe not just, if you tear the EU apart, not just the UK and the EU, but also other member states. Because I had a conversation with an official from a member state who said, of course we'll find a airplane subsidies deal because it's a no-brainer. We're fighting against China, right? I mean, we're trying to figure out rules so that we can, contain China, which is, subsidizing its industry, and we're paying attention to only our dispute over here. And that country, I think, has also come around to the China threat a lot more in other areas. And so I think the debate in Brussels will be interesting to see, which we already saw a little bit in the past 2 years, between the push and pull of, the Trump administration has a point. Well, but here they are again. Trump is saying we're the bad guys, we're worse than China. So I actually think that debate in Brussels is really interesting. So I don't know that we can see the EU. I mean, I've heard the point too that you just articulated on the values not being shared. But I do think that if you want a common enemy, it's China. Everyone agrees to some extent, and we've seen this also with the subsidies discussion with Japan. That, as you said, it's harder to actually get them to work with you, and so I think wasn't Mike Froman on a podcast and gave props to Lighthizer to say, I never got them to do something like that with me. So, I mean, they have something to show. I don't know, where it will go and if that will actually translate into action. But I do think there's a coming to Jesus moment in Europe among some of the member states that see the Trump administration has a point. I just don't know if they can really convince the other member states.
The other member states.
Yeah.
I mean, to kind of Jenny's point, it feels like there has been a shift since the new commission came in. So before that, I think the trilateral discussions were kind of either quiet or stalled in the sense that there was also a lot of misgivings. The Europeans were worried that this would be a vehicle for the U.S. to crack down on European subsidies, and again, to the lack of trust. And then with the new commission coming in, things kind of accelerated, and I think there is more pressure from the member states on the commission to actually do some kind of mini deal or accommodation or however you want to call it with Trump, especially given that the EU now is sort of relatively isolated and that deals have been done with China, with Japan, with South Korea, with the NAFTA countries, and so they're feeling a bit, I think, isolated at the moment.
I do agree with everyone that the trilateral efforts look pretty interesting and potentially really constructive. I think one thing that kind of underscores a lot of my conversations is that yes, we all have a common interest in terms of the United States, the European Union, Japan, other countries, in looking at unfair economic competition from China. But at the same time, all these countries and the companies in these countries are competing for the China market, and that just keeps kind of undercutting that negotiation. If you look at efforts to, for example, multilateralize export controls, that's incredibly difficult to tell your companies that, no, you can't sell there when they might have a competitor who's trying to sell there. Or if you look at the example of European countries, accepting Huawei into their networks, taking investment from the Belt and Road. So those competitive dynamics are absolutely, I think, going to continue to undercut that effort.
So from what you're hearing here and what you're hearing in Europe, the sense of the group is mini deal more likely than a comprehensive deal, and more likely than no deal. Sort of.
Before the election.
Before the election.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
I'd say definitely more than the
Well, let
former.
me throw it-
I
I'm
think
gonna throw-
mini
I'm
deal is
gonna
more
throw-
likely
I
than a
think at some
comprehensive
point-
deal.
Let me
The
throw
second
it-
question is harder.
at some point you run out of time because the
Well-
president's going to go full-time campaign mode.
Well, and you're going to run out of time in another way, which is Trade Promotion Authority runs out July 1, 2021. So whether it is this president in a second term or a first term of a new president, you got a deal by July 1, 2021. Whether it is a mini deal and you're using just Tariff Proclamation Authority and executive orders, or you've got a more comprehensive deal, you are basically out of business as of July 1, 2021. We are basically out of business, unless the first term of the next, I mean, the beginning of the first term, the president, whoever's in the White House, uses a lot of political capital to get the next iteration of Trade Promotion Authority.
That would be very interesting.
It would, wouldn't it? Keep all of us employed. UK, US-UK deal, prospects, timing, content.
I mean, UK. So UK-US is interesting because to the point of the values and shared values, there was one very good analyst who I quoted in one of my stories on US-UK who said, "Oh, the UK is discovering or about to discover just how European the Brits actually are, because." They've got a digital tax. They're in the Iranian nuclear deal. They don't like chlorinated chicken. Any number of things. They like Huawei to build part of their 5G network. And so all of a sudden, this amazing kind of special relationship, this kind of conservative, populist bromance, which was supposed to immediately deliver negotiations for a massive trade deal, it kind of suddenly finds itself caught in the same kind of difficult dynamic that the US has with the EU. And so it really does raise questions about how quickly we're going to get something. The negotiations haven't even started. We're still waiting to hear when they're actually going to be launched. There are doubts about whether they can get done by the end of this year. There too, I would say it's more likely we get a mini deal than we get a comprehensive deal at this point. And of course,
How many a deal are you speculating about?
I mean, it's hard to say. It probably depends on the political imperatives. But the other thing is the timing issue, because I don't know if the US will want to finalize a deal. It's fine for them to start it, but before they know what the terms of the UK's deal with the EU actually are, because on one hand, if there's less regulatory alignment, then maybe it makes it easier to strike a deal with the UK. But on the other hand, for a lot of companies, it makes it harder to use the UK as an export hub to sell into Europe. So, I think you'll want to know what that Brussels-London deal is before you finish things up, and we don't know when that's going to happen.
Do you think the EU slow rolls it during 2020? So Johnson doesn't, you already have press coming out of the EU saying, well, it's not going to happen by the end of 2020. Barnier or Hogan have one or both of them have already said that.
It's looking pretty tricky, and you could argue that the UK is also slow rolling it by taking such a hard line from the outset.
Okay, well, that'll be interesting. Any other deals? Phase 2 Japan deal? Any speculation? Nope. Okay. So I'm going to throw out a couple other countries. Trade war or trade deal. India.
I think there is the potential to see something there. Obviously, it's very difficult to negotiate with India. Probably the more difficult than the Europeans, you would say.
It's a toss-up.
But maybe they've been talking. It seems like there are some realistic things on the table. We'll see if they can get there. That would simultaneously be an extremely mini deal and the largest deal we've ever had with India. Right. So you have to kind of compare these things. I think in terms of getting the point of mini deals more broadly. What is the motivation for the administration at this point to go back to comprehensive trade deals in general? I mean, you have to deal with Congress. Most of the American public doesn't really know the difference. You're able to declare victory, get some wins, and move on. So I do really see that as a model potentially for other countries as well.
Vietnam. Trade war, trade deal.
Nothing.
Nothing. Anybody else?
Kenya.
Kenya.
Mini deal.
Mini deal.
We'll see what they say this week.
By definition.
Okay. Let me ask about. Let me go to. I was going to go to it. Broader trends in trade policy and politics, but I'm actually going to get at that. I'm going to get at that by asking you more of a quote legacy question. So, this president, whether this president concludes his presidency at the end of this year or concludes his presidency 5 years from now, will by definition have an interesting legacy when it comes to trade policy and politics. And a very complicated legacy, very mixed picture. USMCA, arguably, was a Nixon goes to China moment in trade policy. I don't think any of us who've been USTR would have imagined a standalone updating of NAFTA. I was going to, and my successors were going to build it into TPP, which was the politically smart way of getting it done. These guys did it as a standalone. Like it, dislike it, they got it done. China, you may not like the tactics, you may not like the strategy, and the outcome is uncertain. But you can talk to the Obama folks, you can talk to the Bush administration folks. There has been a widespread recognition that there are trade policy and industrial policy issues with China that need to be addressed. We have trade barriers that have gone up. Steel, autos, TPP's been trashed. Both parties are in very different places on trade policy and politics than they were, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or certainly 15 years ago. Speak to me about how you see trend lines in U.S. trade policy and politics and this administration's legacy in trade policy and politics as it stands today, recognizing obviously things could be very different 6 years from now. Have at it, each one of you.
I think bashing China works politically and will stick around. So the next president, doesn't matter what party, I think will have to take on that legacy item because of where the public is, because of where the Congress is now. Obviously, the Republican Party has shifted a lot more towards, bashing China too. So I think that's one item. I think the TPA question that you raised earlier, if there will ever be a new TPA or how that will look, will be really interesting. I think how this administration negotiated NAFTA taught them the lesson that they should bypass Congress as much as they can. And this is, I think, why we see all
Just
these
negotiate
deals.
directly with Richard Trumka?
Interesting. Maybe, yeah. I mean, that worked too. No, so I think they will say, obviously this is a model for how we see, rules of origin and ISDS and all that stuff going forward. I don't know if that all will stick. I think they twisted a lot of arms in the Republican Party on some of that stuff to get there, and could take votes for granted that another president might not be able to do. But it is an achievement. I mean, I was very skeptical, and they got a lot of Democrats to support this. So
They have not had there has not been as strong a bipartisan vote on a major piece of trade legislation, I believe, since the late 1970s.
yeah.
That's when I go back and look at previous trade votes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it is really impressive. I mean, they do deserve, obviously, I mean, Nancy Pelosi deserves credit for that too, because she and her team obviously did also do a lot of heavy lifting. But yeah, I think that's going to be an interesting legacy item, how that plays out, if that really is a template. We can't really compare that to any other deals that they're doing because they're all mini deals and the scope is not at all comparable. But and then tariffs, obviously. Tariffs work to twist someone's arm. I mean, if it's a good outcome or not, there are a lot of countries that came to the table. And so I think if we have another president that wants to look through the trade laws and use 232 and use IEPA and be creative around how he or she wants to use trade policy to get countries to the table, we kind of opened that box. Yeah.
I guess I would say a couple things. First, I think the president gets credit for blowing up what had become some very sterile debates in a lot of areas on the failures of the previous approach to trade to take care of the quote-unquote losers of trade liberalization. There, for as long as I'd been around, been lots of lip service about the fact that if we liberalize, at the aggregate, we'll all be better off. Some people will suffer, but we'll redistribute some gains and they'll be taken care of. And that never really happened, by and large. And so he sort of upended the apple cart and got that looked at in a different way. Likewise on WTO. He has, the complaints about the appellate body seem to be fairly widely shared. They're a legitimate gripe to say, well, this is great to have this system, but if we've got a problem with it and I file a complaint against you, if it's going to take me 10 years to get a resolution, that's not much of a system. And likewise on confronting China. Those were growing bipartisan irritations that were reflected under the latter years of the Obama administration, and he took a different, harsher approach. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is there hasn't always been, in the eyes of some critics, sufficient nuance or coherence to the policy. So it's all upended. Some things are better, some things are worse, but is there really a coherent approach to China going forward? Fully integrated across the administration with, clear articulation to the public so folks know what they're signed on to? Or is it just sort of a generalized get tougher across the board? So I think, the president obviously is going to accentuate the positive sides of that, as I said earlier, and say, look, I made you those 7 promises. I kept them, put me back in. The best is yet to come. But I think the costs, every approach has a cost. We know what the costs were in the old approach because the Trump administration has done an excellent job highlighting them. What have been the costs of this new approach? Some of them we've seen and read about, irritated allies, et cetera, greater inefficiency in some areas of the economy because we've made inputs more expensive for companies. But that'll adjust over time. 5 years from now, how does it look? 10 years from now, might be a different verdict.
Yeah, a couple months ago, things looked pretty dark in terms of the trade agenda. There were that massive tranche of December tariffs on China was going to come into effect, and we didn't know if there would be a China deal signed at the end of the day. We didn't know if Democrats would actually sign on to USMCA, if that deal would be completed. And then pretty quick, in the last couple months, it seems like the administration has been able to reorient that kind of image toward one of political victories. I mean, they're able to claim now that they've renegotiated deals with South Korea, China, Japan, Canada, and Mexico, countries which account for more than half of American trade. If you look under the hood, obviously those trade agreements are much more limited, but updates of previous agreements or mini deals, as we've been talking about. But I don't think the American public is going to necessarily do that investigation, right? So I think those victories do mean that some of these trends in the Trump administration are going to be more lasting. And so absolutely, I would say, one theme going forward is this topic of mini deals that we've been talking about, unless we start to see some kind of pushback from Congress at some point. I mean, is Congress going to, at some point, think that an administration has taken that unilateral approach too far?
Or some of the WTO notices.
Right, or there are more WTO cases, although, where do those go? Are they appealed into the void? So another, that my colleagues mentioned, absolutely the use of these more aggressive trade tools, whether it's Section 301 investigations or tariffs. Even with the Democratic administration coming in, can they roll back the tariffs right away, or do they feel that they have to get some concessions from China before they roll back the tariffs? So it does look like that's a more durable approach. And then the last one that's kind of biggest and most interesting to me is this, new kind of bipartisan consensus on trade as represented by the vote on USMCA, which, as you pointed out, was, overwhelmingly in favor and really interesting. So, obviously the Trump administration has taken a page from the Democratic playbook and the labor union playbook when it comes to some of their positions on USMCA, raising rules of origin, raising labor standards in Mexico, rolling back investor-state dispute settlement. So those are all areas where they've come together, and I think the country is clearly pointing in a different direction in terms of its attitude towards past trade agreements. You don't see Democrats up on the debate stage celebrating free trade. The president rewrote the title of the NAFTA agreement to take out the words free trade, and he did not mention the words free trade during the signing ceremony for USMCA as well. So there's a lot more skepticism about that approach. My big question is, whether this bipartisan consensus on trade works if the politics are reversed. So let's say we do have a President Sanders. Is he going to be able to reach out to populist Republicans in Congress and form some kind of a trade coalition going forward? That seems kind of doubtful to me. On the other hand, I'm not sure how many people would have predicted that Nancy Pelosi would join with Trump, right, on USMCA. So we'll see, but I think we're clearly pointed in a different direction in terms of thinking about trade deals.
Well, I think one of the scenarios, before we go to James, one of the questions built into these scenarios is how many of the tariffs that are currently in place are still in place 1, 2, 5 years from now? Mm-hmm. And what are the implications of that? Mm-hmm. Or how many more are put in place during that period of time? And what are the implications of that, whether it's in terms of retaliation or competitiveness?
You see that kind of policy creep in all areas. Once once an administration has a tool, subsequent administrations will use it.
So I think that in about August of last year, I think there was a real concern within the administration, kind of creeping in, that the legacy of their trade policy would be a bruising recession in an election year in 2020, and I think that's probably what triggered the kind of actually quick reversal of the threats of new tariffs and the move towards an accommodation with the Chinese. And so now we're in a situation where the economic legacy, which is actually, I think, very interesting, is much more mixed. So we saw that the manufacturing sector has suffered a lot, the agricultural sector has suffered a lot, although it's been helped out by the bailout money. But the rest of the economy hasn't struggled in the same way. It's been very much a sort of, the hit has been to business rather than the broader consumer economy. And so I think that it's going to be very interesting to see how that unfolds. On a sort of more global scale, clearly to me the legacy has been that you negotiate with the US on a bilateral basis from now on. It'll be much more difficult to negotiate with the US on a multilateral basis. And as everyone has said, even if the next administration takes a more kind of skeptical attitude towards the use of tariffs, or says, we're not going to wield them in the same way as Trump did, every other official around the world knows that actually, if they wanted to, they can, and they might, and they will, and so I think that threat is kind of going to be hanging out there for some time to come. And it's not just tariffs; it's sanctions and export controls, and all these other instruments. And then, of course, down the line, you wonder, okay, well, what is that going to do to U.S. economic leadership around the world and the dollar and everything else? So, a train might have started, down the tracks that will be hard to control.
So we've got less than a minute left. I'm going to do a quick lightning round because I'm curious. Where do you get your news? because a lot of us get our news from you. Executive branch, legislative branch, how is it to interact with USTR, private sector, Congress?
I got it from Jenny Leonard.
Yeah, exactly. Jenny Leonard's Twitter feed.
Anna?
I mean, you know, Bloomberg, the Washington Post, and the Financial Times. I mean, I have to give a little shout out to Politico in the back. The morning trade newsletter, of course, is great. Yeah, I mean, I think there have been some, maybe some interesting Chinese sources that have popped up over the last year. I mean, it depends on what negotiation you're looking at, right? But yeah, absolutely a time of my colleagues doing great work here.
Dave, Jenny?
I was going to say Twitter, but
Yeah, the president's Twitter.
probably, I mean, that's right. I mean, half the time, certainly last year, the president's, I used to say the president was my assignment editor because, I'd be stepping out of the shower at 6 a.m. and the phone would be ringing with someone saying, have you seen his tweet? And it's like, no, actually, I was in the shower. I have not seen his tweet. But no, you have to cast a wide net. I mean, it's folks up here on the stage, folks in the room, and the president's Twitter feed.
Jenny?
All of the above. Yeah.
Well, please thank this wonderful panel for what they contribute to our field. Well done.